right, here we go. As we've talked about recently, this week's Torah portion, Bamidbar, begins with God instructing Moses to take a census of the Israelite community. Well, really just the Israelite men of fighting age. Women and children are excluded from this count. In part, this is because Moses' task here is to assess the potential size of his army as the Israelites get closer to the Promised Land. Much has been said about the notion of what it means to count, in terms of broadly taking a census and knowing the size of one's community. We've also been talking a lot lately about the notion of counting in the context of the 7-week period of counting the Omer, in which we find ourselves right now. And there's also the notion of the way in which Moses is instructed to count each Israelite by lifting up the head of each person being counted. It also feels serendipitous that this portion about acknowledging each individual within a community should fall just at the beginning of LGBTQ plus Pride Month. In that vein, I want to share a story that I've now heard a couple of times in recent months, most recently from my friend and colleague, Rabbi Daniel Bogard, who's a rabbi and an activist in St. Louis, that speaks to this notion of truly lifting up the head of one individual's story, particularly someone whose story might otherwise go overlooked. In the book A Rainbow Thread, an anthology of queer Jewish literature which collects stories and texts covering nearly 2,000 years of Jewish history, there's a story which originally appeared in the Yiddish Jewish Daily Forward in 1936. The original letter to the Vorwärts, as it was known in Yiddish, written by Samuel Katofsky, appeared in response to a number of stories during the 1936 Summer Olympics in Berlin, during which a number of female athletes returned from their home countries as men, and these stories were widely covered in both the Jewish and non-Jewish press. Katofsky, though, writes in to explain that this phenomenon of gender transition is nothing new in his experience, and shares a story in Yiddish from his hometown of Krivozor, a small shtetl in southern Ukraine, which likely took place sometime in the late 19th century. He describes how a young Jew from his town, raised as a girl named Bela, had always felt uncomfortable with gender. He writes, not quite a woman, but also not quite a man. Here's his letter. Worthy editor of the Forward, not long ago I read a story in the Forward that took place in America about how a girl became a man. But that's not news to the people in the town where I'm from. Permit me to tell you the story in your paper. In our shtetl of Krivozor in Ukraine, everyone knew Bela, the girl who sold herring, geese, and other foodstuffs. She was a tall redhead and sturdily built. The way she carried herself always brought forth an uncertain feeling, something like, she's not quite a woman, but also not quite a man. When she was still a child, her father would often take her to see the Tolna Rebbe, Reb Dovid, and sometimes to the Sadagura Rebbe to ask for help. The only answer he ever got was, God will help, God will help. The father would return home anguished and unhappy. In the meantime, the years flew by, and Bela grew too, until she reached the age of 23. One fine morning, Bela left for Odessa, where she was introduced to an important professor. She spent a long time under his care, under which Bela eventually became a man. The story was well known, and it was in all the papers. All of Russia talked of it. In the shtetl, we waited impatiently for her return, and on the day when Bela was to arrive, half the shtetl ran to the bridge to greet her, or better said, to greet him. And she wasn't called Bela anymore. Now she was Beryl. And when we saw her, it was as if we were stunned. Before our eyes was a handsome, healthy, red-headed man. Anyone who didn't know Bela previously would never have known that he had been a girl. From then on in the shtetl, he was called Beryl Bela. With the help of the professor, the government freed him from military service. Beryl Bela soon learned to daven and was in synagogue every day. Later on, he got married to an old girlfriend, Rachel, who was a nice girl. In our shtetl, Beryl Bela always had a good name as a fine, upstanding Jew. This really is an incredible story for a number of reasons. First, there's sometimes a notion in some circles of our society today that argue that the phenomenon of trans folks or intersex folks is somehow new. But this story demonstrates that trans folks have always been a reality of our world. Indeed, the rabbis of the Mishnah in the first century of the Common Era identify something like 7 different gender categories, suggesting that gender identity has always been more fluid than simply male or female. Second, we might think that a traditional Jewish community in late 19th century Ukraine would not be accepting of a trans man, and yet this story offers a glimpse into the beauty of radical acceptance of one person's expression of their true identity in one particular community. As Noam Sienna, the author of A Rainbow Thread, explains in the introduction, these kinds of stories are a recovery of a lineage which has been denied and withheld from the people who have sought it. History is important for everyone, but it takes on a special importance when evidence of one's very existence has been manipulated and censored, forgotten, buried, and destroyed. Finally, it is a reminder that all any of us want as human beings is to be accepted and loved for who we are. As we sing in Dan Nichols' interpretation of Asher Yatzar, the blessing that celebrates the complexities of the human body, I'm perfect the way I am and a little broken too. Indeed, each and every one of us is perfect as we are, made in the image of the divine, and inevitably, each of us is also grappling to make peace with the various complex elements that make us who we are. Our task as fellow travelers through life is to embrace the fullness of each and every individual who comes before us, celebrating their uniqueness and the gifts they bring into our world and our lives. Wishing you a happy Pride and a Shabbat Shalom.